Welcome everyone to the last round of the day. On the opening of this house would prioritize police force. So on the opening down with Mara A, and then open opposition with Mara B, closing up Masalah Tusan, and closing up what he said. So without further ado, I want to invite the Prime Minister. Yeah.
Madam Chair, the Police Force United States is a force often associated with the lack of transparency, the lack of accountability, and the continuous inefficiency along with the rise of political rhetorics. So we think that it's time we do something and make a sufficient change in order to guarantee that all these problems are solved. Our model is simple. Our model is that we'll use private company, we'll screen them, ensure that only the best is appointed. Companies are then subject to contractual obligation to have submit reports, audits, report on surveillance, data gathered, and all those things. Their general responsibility is peacekeeping, and we have reasonable expectation on a contractual obligation basis. That means that they contractually have to perform at a certain level in order to not be sued and in order for us to not take action upon them. So we think this ensures a certain degree of efficiency and certain degree of standard in which we're able to see these individuals perform. So firstly, what is the problem under status quo? We tell you that under status quo, government have a lack of incentive to disclose problems in which the police force faces. In other words, the government overprotect the police force because their reputation is inherently tied to the reputation of the police forces. Things like they may try to reduce accountability, reduce transparency, lack of incentive to publish and disclose, police inefficiency, corruption, and racial discrimination, all those issues that are very inherent towards the police forces. All of this, that means that the government do not set up enough regulatory bodies in order to go in and make sure that all these issues are solved, because any highlight upon those issues will tie back towards the government and their name. No, thank you. So we think that they have then no incentive to restrict, regulate, and bring any of these issues into attention. So we think that the lack of incentive to be transparent and accountable is something that's extremely problematic. No, thank you. We also say that the government has a certain degree of control over the media and the ability to control the narrative. That means that the government have an inherent power to control the narrative on the ground, as well as move it towards, even in the United States, they have a certain degree of ability to control the narrative, because the government necessarily have to hold the media to a certain standard of accountability and also have to prescribe certain amount of narrative towards the media. No, thank you. So we think that they inherently have too much power to control the media, as well as put the narrative in the benefit of the police. This is inherently problematic, especially when it comes to things like security, and the highlight upon the crime rates and the highlight upon the inefficiency of police is something that's sometimes highlighted, but most often disregarded, especially in the context of United States. No, thank you. We also say that the government has a certain degree of connection over the courts, policy making, as well as the law. That means that the law are tailored to reduce accountability towards police. Things like racial profiling is a reasonable standard of reaction, and a reasonable amount of protection is given to police who discriminate people on the basis of race. So we think that's extremely problematic, especially in light of the recent Ferguson case. So we think this gives overprotection towards the police forces, as well as a lack of accountability towards the police forces. No, thank you. Let's compare this to the incentive to change under our paradigm. What we do is that, especially in countries where government outsource their services like transport and all those things, they operate under a stricter supervision because government have reasonable expectation upon these people, because it's an enforceable contract. And the government pay you a certain amount of money, therefore the government has reasonable expectation into how you're willing to conduct yourself. So we think that the government are more incentivized to take more actions, and in order to make sure that these police forces do their best and are accountable to their enforceable contract. No, thank you. Furthermore, we say that when you enforce they have general contractual obligations that are perfectly defined. Because under status quo, we are not entirely sure into what are the police obligations, what are the standard of conduct in which the police are able to operate on. And in a moment in which you're able to sue the government, those standards are differentiated at every point in time. So we think that in a situation where you're able to make perfectly reasonable contractual obligations, then you're able to perfectly define the responsibilities and the parameters of responsibility of a police, and we think those things are much better. Before that opening.
Why would a private police force, motivated by the profit margin and wanting to retain government contracts, want to disclose events of police abuse or prisoners dying in itself?
Profitability of this company is directly linked to their capability to perform. That means that there is a contractual obligation for them to disclose things like audits, for them to disclose things like reports, and for them to disclose things like all these rates of crime and things like that. Secondly, because the government is now divorced from the police force, it's very easy for the government to have a separate enforcement body in order to investigate what's going on and whether or not this police force actually are conducting performing their conduct according to what they have to do. That means that if the government is separate from this body, the government has more ability to check upon this body and make sure that this body are performing better. So we see on our side, overall, we definitely have more accountability and more transparency in a condition where, in a situation where it's particularly pertinent to have all of these things. In the context of police forces, where every individual, where every police is important, and we need to know that every police is able to conduct within reasonable standards and are able to perform their duties and obligations reasonably. It's very important that we know a method or metrics in which you are able to measure their conduct and set a certain standard in which you are able to perform all these obligations. Everything is particularly important. So we think it's very important that you have a police forces where reputation is not inherently tied to the government, that they are free of the political rhetorics that the government inherently is running. All those issues, that political issues that will be intertwined with the police issues, we think all those things are extremely dangerous towards the operation and the efficiency of the police forces. We think all those things are extremely damaging towards the operations and the way the police force operate. So we also say that we need to maintain a level of standard in which we control these police forces, and that level of standard and efficiency can only be achieved the moment you tie that back to profitability. Because in any situations where these private police forces misconduct or they do something wrong, they are entitled to be sued. That means that they will lose profitability every time they don't do their job well. We think this is a very good incentive for them to perform their job according to standard, and that's what we want on site government. We propose.
Thank you, Prime Minister, and now I would like to invite the leader of the opposition. Okay.
Madam Chair, I just realized that Jasmine just registered for the Republican Party. But let's look what practically OG has brought up here. What they wanted to do is a form of tender process where various defense groups, like even probably Lockheed Martin, can actually apply and somehow to get this tender and be part of the process instead. So this debate has to be educated on two questions. That firstly, who better fulfills the role of the police according to the Police Code of Ethics? And the second question will be, who will be able to reduce crime rate in general? Second of all, is that we support whatever it is in the status quo. Probably give them more trading, more financing, and we even agree to certain things like surveillance, or even have bullet counts for that. Fundamentally, those are the things that we agree on. But we disagree on the idea of the standard process, and we only agree a police is being controlled by the state and by the people. Let's look at the rebuttals that we have over here. Her main problem is the structural problems that exist within the police force. We agree that there are some, but we think it's even worse when you put a profit incentive to it. Let's look at the first level. According to her, somehow these police forces would become much more transparent, apparently. Apparently, she doesn't understand how most companies work when it comes to company secrets. Because firstly, when there's somehow a form of screw up, then it's more likely for the companies are able to control the situation because they have an incentive to keep their PR. That's where they control the whole situation. Second of all, somehow she thinks that the media will overblow whatever form of transparency there is. Look, when you're a corporate company in America, you are most likely to be a part of a conglomerate that which are probably linked to the media company, like probably Fox, etc. That's where they have the ability to control the media and somehow downplay the issues concerning Ferguson, and you are less likely to see these kind of things being discussed on a national level. Just look how much money probably all the lobbies try to shut up about the effects of sugar to some extent, and that is already bad enough on how they control the media and the perception to which sugary drinks. Imagine that harm when it comes to guns on the street. The second structural problem they have is about how this becomes much more transparent because you have a tender process and they have a look. There's a reason why we allow people, why we don't have this tender process. Firstly, it's because when it comes to the police force of accountability when it comes to true democracy. Because firstly, let's say for example, if a person who wants to run as the mayor of the state, let's say Mayor Giuliani in New York, he would also recommend who are the personnel who might be the police commissioner there. On their paradigm, that means this process is taken away from the people. Only a select group of elite politicians try to calculate economically who is the best person who is we are able to reduce costs. Understand this quote. When you have the voting process, and if you are not happy of the policing methods, you can just vote out that mayor. And the next mayor who comes in have to pick a new police commissioner who may have different policies. And this also extends when it comes to policies on how you police certain situations. Like how in the past in New York, people voted in a certain mayor, a mayor, and that mayor somehow agrees with zero policy methods. Under their paradigm, the state is captured as a hostage by saying that, look, we are the only choice, the viable choice for you to pay, but we must be allowed to have somehow freedom to actually control our company ethics or our company's modus operandi. So at the end of the day, the companies would have an upper hand on how to actually have policing and how they can control how the policing works. People are taken away from that democratic process. But now it becomes even worse when you have a profit incentive, when lobby groups can actually push within state legislation, like state legislation, on actually how making laws that are much more flexible for them on the ground. So when you want to compare, if somehow laws are much more flexible on your side, but at least there is no profit incentive and lobby groups does not want to actually touch it because there is no profit incentive in general and they will practically stay away from it. The tender process forces these lobby groups to be part of it. There are three arguments I'm going to make today. First, I'm going to argue about harms of a private law enforcement system. Second of all, I'm going to talk about how this would create a climate of fear similar to the military-industrial complex. And lastly, I'm going to talk about why the tender process is extremely harmful. But before that, any of you?
Yeah, tell us why exactly it is the case that a state body has any more incentive to disclose allegations against that private company.
Because in the form of democracy, the people are the state. Because they want to know a certain incentive what is going on in a certain situation, and somehow the people on the ground are able to investigate. When you have a private company, they are more likely to control the media within the situation. At least when the state is actually acting on your behalf, and the police are the agents of the state. The police commissioner wants to keep his job and investigate. A company has a different incentive by having profit instead. How is a private law enforcement? Firstly, is that when you add the perverse profit incentive, their main goal is practically to their main goal normally would probably be try to somehow keep police a certain area. But the problem here is that their business can exist as long as the crime is actually present within this situation. What happens here is that they are less likely to totally exterminate a certain crime within the region, and they will do token arrests just to fulfill their key performance index. That means they are less likely, they are more likely to avoid high-profile crimes because the risk would be too high. And this is the best situation for organized crime to actually proliferate because these policemen would have to think about the funding, whatever they have, and actually have to reduce the risk when it comes to actually doing raids in these areas. Second of all, you have to understand the characterization of the corporate culture of America. And most businesses are mainly conglomerates and also interconnected. For example, Lockheed Martin, if they win the defense contracts, that means they would they would be related to they are also related to the Bank of America. So when somehow there is white collar crime happening within the jurisdiction of interest, and they are less likely to investigate white collar crime. What happens here is that now crime is focused on the lower to the middle income group, and instead of actually investigating people of white collar crimes, this kind of crimes are more likely to get away in general. Second of all, the concentration on the ghettos would be even worse, because that is where most of the time they can make these tokenistic arrests, actually exacerbating the situation and the racial tensions that actually exist. So the conclusion here in general is that you are less likely to get white collar criminals to get arrested, but you are more likely to get blue collar criminals to be arrested instead. This second argument, how it creates a climate of fear. Why? How so? Is because there is a profit incentive, and most of these politicians can be bought out by private companies, just like how we see in other lobby groups. That is why they try to argue consistently and try to hype up the crime within a certain situation. Rather than exterminating crime, they will have things like war on drugs or the war on terror, so they can justify extra funding for these lobby groups. At the end of the day, you're going to encourage the militarization of the police even worse, and you continuously create an extension of the military-industrial complex. Look, we don't want the police to be a private force that feeds off money and feeds off our security. At least when the police is owned by the state, it is owned by people like you and I.
It is a lie to say that when police forces are owned by the state, that are owned by normal citizens like you and I. Because we don't think that police forces are accountable to these individuals, specifically because the accountability is always attached to the state. And we think that the lack of disclosure or the transparency that the state operates upon is because these are agents that utilizes our authority and they utilize our power. And we think on that side of the house, you have it's less likely that individuals will be able to participate in the ability to choose the best kind of security force. Before I move on to my substantive, firstly, let's look at this. Terence spent a lot of time bashing our model on tenders being an issue, right? Because he told you it's about profit making, therefore your PR will always be maintained and you will never want to disclose information. Firstly, we don't think that that's necessarily true, because in a functioning democracy, criticism will always come every single time. But a distinction between a private corporation and the state is that the attitudes of the state is to always deflect criticism by amplifying other positive benefits that they allow or they give to society. For example, our economy is doing well, no thank you, irrespective of the way in which our police forces work, at the very least, everyone is fed and taken care of. Versus, when you have a private corporation relying upon the brand that they have, considering that this is not one security company, that you have other competing security companies, you want to win the trust of the people in order to ensure that you can effectively decide and make decisions for people. This is better because companies always want to protect the kind of image that they have. Therefore, the ethics and regulation that they employ onto police forces is a lot more stringent as opposed to just saying big ambiguous things like, no thank you, you can always rely on your senses, for example. Secondly, they told you that politicizing the police force means that individuals won't get to have a voice and flexible laws won't happen. We don't think that this is necessarily true, because we don't think that the ability for individuals to have a political voice is dependent upon the state owning particular entities within society. We think that individuals can always rely upon that there are political candidates that will always fight or champion for different things, and it's not mutually exclusive to just politicizing the police, privatizing the police force. They also told you it's about corporations controlling the media. Sure, we can concede that in some scenarios that might necessarily happen. But on a comparative note, thank you, the state will always be able to effectively shut down the kind of discourse and discussion, because the kind of reputation that they have, for example, is a lot worse. And we think that the state being able to utilize the narrative that society has means that the public perception and trust towards the police force is a lot harder, or it's a lot more ambiguous, right? And I'll go to that later within my speech. No, thank you. They also told you that now police forces will make tokenistic arrests. Firstly, we see inside opening government that irrespective of how good your police force are or who is running that police force, crimes will always exist. You don't obliterate all crimes just because, no thank you, the private company is taking care of that. But we also think, Mr. Speaker, on the outside of the house, policemen can't choose because their responsibility is to a collective security of the entire nation versus, for example, security guards guarding an apartment and maybe making tokenistic measures of checking who is entering that apartment to begin with. That's the distinction, because your responsibility is to a larger individual within society. We don't think police forces will make tokenistic action. They told you that crimes won't attack police forces won't attack white-collar crime. We don't think this is true. We think in a functioning democracy, people will always criticize the way in which we don't subject individuals of a higher income bracket to crimes. That's why we say the way in which legislation has operated, Mr. Speaker, in the past, things like, no, thank you, federal laws only having 3 offences when you're talking about corporations versus right now having 270 offences credited to corporations means that individuals always question whether or not white-collar crimes is real. We think that the case from Terence was a bit weird. Before I move on, I'll take closing.
In many states of America, they already have ombudsmen, independent agencies appointed by independent commissioners to check on government abusers, including police abusers. Why is it not sufficient to deal with the following?
We don't think it's sufficient because the ability for states, like I said, to deflect the kind of information that you have and say, A, we don't think that that's necessarily true because under their side, they'll just say, ombudsmen don't understand critical government making decisions and deflect that criticism. But secondly, they also say, you have to compare on a comparative, right? The ability for states to provide positive outcomes in other aspects of the society means that one flaw within the state means that the state can always push it away and say, yes, we've made flaws, but this is not the entirety of the government. Versus the company relying upon the perception of individuals trusting that company in providing security. We don't think they'll push individuals to make tokenistic arrests and just target people racially. No, thank you, sir. Jasmine told you many different things that was never engaged upon. The kind of attachment to the state means that the states can always deflect the focus in which we give to individuals. This means that there's an overprotection to the police force because there's an attachment of agency to the way in which you're making decisions. People or the state always close ranks in scenarios where the police make decisions, make bad decisions, for example. But how do we necessarily hold people to accountability? We think that when you have the police force, no thank you, the removal of the attachment of the police force to the state, you remove the concept that the police force are gods and not necessarily attributable to the law. What do we mean by this? We want the ability for you to disclose allegations. We want the ability for police to be prosecuted in scenarios where they target individuals that are way beyond their scope of responsibility. But we think that when you're attached to the state and as an agent of the state more likely than not close ranks and make this and says that you did not necessarily make a mistake and make a comparison of rhetoric as opposed to the facts that happens, Mr. Speaker. For example, they rely upon the rhetoric that this person shot a black African American child by mistake, but that doesn't mean that all of his duties as a police officer was absolved. And we think that the state always relies upon this rhetoric. But secondly, we also say that police makes decisions that affects the credibility of the state. When the state separates itself and gives it to a private company, it means that it's detaching the ability for them to always having to take responsibility or cloud or covering the responsibility. But secondly, it also allows the state to actively say that this is a service that is necessarily for society to receive the best side. But thirdly, we also say that it also allows for companies to have a stronger work ethics in the way in which they regulate themselves because of the brand perception that we told you in our speech. But fourthly, we also say that it creates a new structure of meritocracy, especially within the police force. Because you have to recognize, especially in the United States of America, the way in which individuals are promoted or receive meritocracy is extremely ambiguous. For example, if a person is a daughter or a dynasty of a particular officer, will more likely get promotion. Or if a person manages to solve a cold case that no one really cared about, that person gets promotion. Under our side of the house, you disallow the older generations or people that are exclusive or elite within that scenario to constantly be promoted, but allow for individuals that are meritorious under our side of the house. But lastly, right now, the way in which you're out of order, the way in which the public perceives the police force is that they are protected by the state, they are demigods, and we can never question them. At the very least, when they're attached to a private corporation, disengaged from the state, you allow for society to have a better perception in terms of the discussions that we have to how do we necessarily treat a police force and how a police force treats them. In the way in which if a public good is not utilized efficiently, we think that that's when we have to move away from the state.
Are you gonna call me?
Madam Speaker, we admit that even under our model, police abuse, police brutality, and mistreatment of criminals may occur, and maybe most probably does occur. This debate isn't about how do we best reduce that, not just about how do we best reduce that. This debate is also about under which paradigm do we best deal with that problem, and under which paradigm are these police officers or these law enforcement agencies more accountable to the people? How do we weed out the bad policemen? How do we keep in the good ones? The fundamental problem and the biggest, missing logic that came from opening government was that what they told you was profit motive exists for these private corporations to go out and police crime, to reduce crime rates, to use their weapons well. But suddenly that profit motive completely disappears when it comes to, for example, wanting to cover up crimes, wanting to cover up police violence and police abuses. Suddenly these corporations have no incentive to lie to people or to cover up these cases, as we've shown you they've done before. They've never told you why suddenly that profit motive or that altruism disappears under their model. So I'm going to talk to you about three things. First, about accountability. Secondly, about enforcement of the law. Thirdly, about police methods. Firstly, about accountability. They told you that if the police are only accountable to profits and a government contract, that they will always do whatever it is that the government wants and fulfill the roles of the government. But this is insufficient, ladies and gentlemen, because firstly, we told you that under status quo, we have at least some partial control over the police force, as well as the accountability that the police force have. That means all the things the police does necessarily can be controlled by voters, if not proactively, then retrospectively. Under your model, you elect a politician. Politician goes to Congress, and Congress decides, or your state legislature decides, who to give that contract to. Under our model, at least an individual gets to vote in a governor or a mayor who already wants to appoint a police commissioner. You are absolutely sure who is going to run that police force. You are absolutely sure whether or not that police commissioner is someone who has a track record of violence, who has a track record of discriminating African-American criminals, for example. These are things you can be sure of. Under your model, it is opaque and even more untransparent. Secondly, what do we think happens under their model? Because they told us, hang on, the state should be able to detach itself and criticize the police force as it is. We don't think this is true. Under your model, when you abdicate the role of the police from the state, then essentially anything the police does wrong, even if there are structural problems that exist within governance and politics, is abdicated from that responsibility. So if you look at the Ferguson shooting, right? So the white on black violence in America isn't just a police problem. It's a deeply rooted structural problem in governance and in society, in things like racial inequality, discrimination against minority groups, for example. Under your model, it will just be a business failure, a business mistake, a mistreatment, ladies and gentlemen. Under our model, when it is the police force who are agents of the state committing these crimes, we can hold them accountable. We can ask, why is this police commissioner telling his policemen to do these things? Why is this mayor elected this police commissioner in the first place? These are things we can hold them accountable to. Under your model, it's just a business thing. Thirdly, under our model, ladies and gentlemen, we think more policemen are likely to come out and speak out against police violence. We are more likely to protect whistleblowers as well as people who speak out against maltreatment in the system. Why? Because under your model, the police are employees of a company. That means if a policeman witnesses his colleague shooting an unarmed black teenager, he is not likely to want to report this to the public because he's likely to lose his job and probably never going to be employed by any other police agency. Under the state model, ladies and gentlemen, a policeman can come forward because he is essentially invested in his community. He has, for example, protection under the law as well as witness protection programs, for example, which are advocated because the profit motive of an employee is more than that of a policeman who feels indebted to his community. Under your model, more things get covered up and no one wants to report it because they're more likely thinking about their salaries rather than having a job at the end of the day. Lastly, about this thing about promotions that Jay said. We don't want old people to get promoted. That's the danger of that model, ladies and gentlemen. You are telling policemen that the more bullets you shoot, the more people you arrest, it is more likely that you will get promoted. What is this? Why is this harmful? This is exactly what Terence told you. Because under their model, right, and this leads me to my second issue about enforcement of the law. Under your model, basically the private police force only remains only gets the government contract or only gets as much government support if there are crime rates in the first place. That means that although they have key performance index, they're likely to want to keep crime going and deal with small instances or small sporadical violent attacks or assaults, rather than things like organized crime or deep-rooted community crimes, ladies and gentlemen. So, for example, a policeman, rather than wanting to, for example, take out a drug South Chicago, would rather go for sporadic arrest of individual people so that it looks like they're doing their job, but in fact, they're allowing the crime rate to continue to proliferate so that they continue to get these government contracts in the long run. And remember, even if we think the crime is still happening, we have no control over this because we can't vote these people in or out. Before I move on, yes, I'll take those.
State policemen are largely made up of these individuals who grow up and have lived in this community their entire lives. These kinds of racial prejudices are ingrained within them. Why are they the most effective instruments of policing in these communities?
Firstly, the fact that you're part of that community probably means you have more of an accountability and commitment to that community rather than your employees in a private company. But secondly, we have multiple ways of weeding out racist policemen or bad behaving policemen, ladies and gentlemen. Of course, we don't agree with the Ferguson jury's decision. We are likely to indict these people as well. Secondly, on this part about white-collar crimes, this is something a large. No, white-collar crimes are being dealt with because, hey, look, our conviction rates are up. No, the point is, ladies and gentlemen, when you are, for example, an employee of Lockheed Martin or Boeing, a defense contractor who probably took out a loan at Bank of America, who probably is also a partner or a subsidiary of General Motors or Ford Motors because they build engines and aircraft engines together as well, you are essentially interconnected within the business framework or business network of corporate America. So what does this mean? A, you are less likely to want to clamp down on white-collar crimes, crimes that involve businessmen, CEOs, and company executives, because this will essentially ruin the business relationship these people have. You're less likely to want to clamp down on corrupt politicians because politicians are the ones giving you the contracts in the first place. Thirdly, you're more likely to focus all your attention on protecting elite or high income areas because those are the people that are going to give money to your lobby groups. Those are the people who are going to give money to your corporations and give money to, give money to governments and make political donations to governments as well. Ladies and gentlemen, at the end of the day, we showed you, if there are bad laws and bad policies, we can change them when it's within the grasp of voters. But letting a tender process take over this will not only lead to worse policing, it will lead to bad police methods, and the worst part about it is we can't change it.
Here, here. Thank you, Dr. And now I would like to invite member of government to wrap the case for close.
Madam Speaker, from closing, we're going to give you two main ideas. We're going to tell you, first of all, that it's much easier for the most important actors in conflicts with police, who are the people, to call the police out and report their atrocities when there is a dissociation between the police and the state. Secondly, we're going to deal with this idea of a profit motive and tell you why that already exists in status quo and why in any case that's not a bad thing. But before we get into these extensions, let's deal with a lot of rebuttals, right? Let's deal with this primary idea that's been coming from them, which is that somehow it is a bad idea when the commissioners of the police forces can no longer be appointed by the political people who have just won elections. While we appreciate the sentiment, we in fact think that it's not a particularly good idea to politicize the appointments within the police force in this way. Because what we have been seeing is that when you allow politicians to make the calls with regards to who becomes the people who have power within these forces, they tend to be an extension of their political ideology. So when Republicans come into power, they tend to appoint police commissioners who have promised to take a harder stance on things like illegal immigrants. When Democrats come to power, they promise to take a harder stance on things like white-collar crime. We think that this is not a particularly good thing for efficient management of the police force because it results in a force that doesn't have any idea of a consistent guidance on what it is ultimately working towards, a force that keeps swinging between multiple objectives that are the result of politicization that this side wants to so badly introduce into the police force. We don't think that's necessarily a good thing. But secondly, they spoke to you about why whistleblowers are likelier to come forward when it is state police as opposed to private police. We think opening already dealt with this idea. When the state has an incentive to cover up its own acts, we in fact think that it's going to be harder for whistleblowers to come up under status quo. In our extension, we'll tell you why it's easier for people and whistleblowers to come out against the police when we adopt this model. But let's also deal with this general idea that's been running across decades, right? That these private policies will make tokenistic arrests because they want to show that they are fighting against crime on the official records, and the idea that there will be a focus on certain profit-generating ideas such as white-collar crime as opposed to more violent crime. We don't think any of these harms are mutually exclusive with the status quo, because what we have to realize is that even the state police that exists right now are assessed on roughly the same parameters, right? Which are things like how many arrests they make, how effective they have been in cracking down, etc. So the incentive to be making these tokenistic arrests exists on both sides of the houses. But when it comes to things like fighting white-collar crime, I'm going to talk to you a bit later about the idea of why police have a profit motive even in status quo, which is why it's equally likely that they will crack down upon the sort of crimes that this side thinks private police will have a greater incentive to crack down on. But they also spoke about this idea that somehow private police is going to be reluctant to go after politicians, etc., because they're the ones who are giving them the contracts. That's hypocrisy on their part. If they say police commissioners have to be appointed by politicians, we think it's a bit of a stretch on their side to expect that there is going to be greater neutrality when it comes to the state police who now have to be acting against these same politicians who appointed them in their jobs in the first place. Right? Having dealt with that, let's get into the crux of the debate. We think that this move is fundamentally about holding the police accountable in the US, given the context of maltreatment that has been alleged against the police. We think that the best actors to do this are in fact the people on the ground. Why is that so? Because while we acknowledge opening's point that the state will now have a greater incentive to act against police forces because of the dissociation, we don't think that the state always even has knowledge of the police brutalities and atrocities that are happening on the ground level. More than often, it is individuals, powerless, who are on the ground, who are affected the most by the crackdowns that the police make on them in an illegal manner. What we want to do is to incentivize these individuals to come forward and call out the police on their actions and report the atrocities that has been happening. For this, we think that it's important to have a clear message of dissociation between the force of the state and the police as an organ to be sent out to the people. Because what's the biggest barrier that exists right now to people coming forward and reporting the police? They understand that they're going to be putting themselves in a position where they are standing up against the force of the state. Which is why right now, police brutality is seen as an extension of state oppression. What we are doing with our message is to change that paradigm and instead present a picture where people are detached from the government, who is detached from the idea of these police bodies. We think that in fact encourages people to come forward because they no longer expect that the weight of the state is going to be put behind the idea of defending them. Let's deal with what closing has in mind. Right? They spoke about how there exists ombudsman in cities, things like that. We acknowledge, we do think that there are independent courts, we do think that there are ombudsmen, we don't think they are effective though. The reason for that is this: when you go to the ombudsman or the court, you are still in a battle with the state, which means that the massive resources and force of the state is still invested into winning the case against you. Which is why you have that much less incentive to even go to independent parties if you know that the party on the other side is the state. What we want to do is to dissociate the force of the state from the police force so that the only party is in fact the police force. We in fact think that this also encourages the state to come forward and call out these things. Because we understand that if there is we think that generally there is a greater incentive to call out private companies for the wrongs that they do. We all like this popular conception of a big evil corporation, right? Which is why when we think that when it comes to things like media sensationalism, etc., ordinary people on the ground are that much more empowered to act against police if in fact they are associated with corporate powers. But before we proceed, I'll take over.
Now, all of what they did is assuming that there are brave civilians who do so. And other paradigms, both paradigms, this can exist. The question that becomes, what exactly do I have to be a whistleblower when I know I would lose my job? And
right. When you're a whistleblower, it's easier for you to go up against the police, come out in open, contact media houses, when you know that the force of the state is not going to be invested in the fight against you. That's the same dissociation that we just explained to you. But secondly, let's also look at this idea of a profit motive, right? We don't think that it's any different from status quo, especially in the context of massive budget cuts in the US and the recession that has left most government departments bankrupt. What we understand is that most at the local level are self-funded, which is why, for example, if you've been following the news, you would have noticed that there has been a spike in instances of civil asset forfeiture by the police in the US, precisely because they have every motive to try and make as much money as possible to fund themselves. That's not a mutually exclusive harm that you have identified. But more importantly, what we told you is that even if people think that there is a profit motive, that's more for private companies than for government companies, that's a good thing. It gives that much more incentive for people to hate private companies more, to make private vulnerable to the scrutiny of individuals. It makes it that much more easier for individuals to fight battles against these giant corporations as opposed to a fight against the giant state. And we think that the former case is much better for the interest of transparency and accountability. And for these reasons, we are very proud to put forward our case.
So I did not see that.
Madam Speaker, the extension of the closing opposition is simply that this policy will only harm police enforcement and the ability of the police to do their work effectively, and that's bad. But before that, let's deal with what was said by the entire government bench. So firstly, in the closing government, they said that it's wrong to have the status quo because you result in the politicization of appointments. And by that, of like the head of police and so on and so forth here. And by that, it meant you're going to have one commissioner 1 year caring about white collar crime, and maybe 5 years later, when a new commissioner is appointed, he's caring more about other kinds of crimes. We don't see what is the big deal about that, because every police enforcement agency always has a priority on crimes to go after resources. And often the priorities are set up, whether it's a result of the Republicans setting the agenda or the Democrats, reflects often the public good as well. That's what I think is most important. So we don't think it's a bad idea if the Democrats or the Republicans deciding what kinds are more important. Ultimately, crime still gets tackled, and we think that that's still a good thing. Unless what they're saying is that crime doesn't get tackled and some other there's more anarchy. It's not what they're really saying at all. Then secondly, we heard in the member of government speech. I really tell how it's different from what the opening government was saying. He said that essentially the big benefit of this policy is that now you can report the crime, and because now this model, you get a different outcome. Now, the question I ask them is, who are you going to report as a public person to that result in a different outcome from the status quo? Because it is the government who's appointing these contractors to run police force. Now, I presume you're going to have to report to the government. So now let's see what the logic was in the opening government. So that's where, honestly, the logic really first started. They argue on the side of opening government that if the government now appoints contractors and it's no longer directly responsible, then they're more incentivized to be aggressive and to go after the police cops. But the same argument works against them, right? So if it's the government who's awarding contracts, it means the government has decided who will get a contract, then the blame still falls on the government at some point or other. And by that logic, government would they be more cautious still about investigating brutality and whatnot, because they're worried about being blamed for punishing someone who wasn't good at their job. But in fact, what really happens in status quo, Madam Speaker, is that the government does respond pretty well to accusations, of incidents of violence and brutality in the police force. And this is done in a few ways. Firstly, like my opening opposition brilliant pointed out, there's the vote. Like, if a mayor isn't doing his job in tackling crime, he is voted out, and that's why you get political pressure on the police force. But secondly, a point I kept raising throughout the debate, there's the ombudsman, an independent body set up to regulate and oversee and often investigate accusations of abuses, not just in the police force, but often in many government agencies. It's anything that's set up in many states in America. I mean, it's a perfectly fine mechanism. How does
does it work? What you often have is you get one or panel of people who form this agency, and they're given lifetime tenure, so they're immune to any kind of political influence because they can never get sacked. They're almost like the Supreme Court judges, in that they can never get sacked by the government because of differences in political views, and they're the same powers as anyone else in investigating abuses, and they're also often able to go into the police department and demand to see the records of all the arrests that we made, demand to see all the various crimes that they investigated, and make public their findings. So often you already have in the status quo a mechanism by independent oversight without having contracts being part and parcel of the process. That actually, this mechanism is no different from, say, having an auditor general of a country who is empowered by the constitution to investigate how public is spending money and report on that. And after that, result in a shading effect on governments, and then things change accordingly. So we need them to tell us, why can't you rely on an independent agency to investigate and give you the same information you are asking for? All you want, like they say in the final speech, you want audits, you want to know what they're doing, you just want transparency. If an independent agency can give the same information, and that's one part of the status quo, why not stick with that? I didn't hear the answer other than it's different because an independent agency is just like the government. No, it's not. They've got a lifetime tenure. They can never be sacked literally by anyone, just like Supreme Court judges. Sit down, sir. Now, let's go into some pieces of extension. I'm going to look at basically our main extension is that this results in less effective policing. So, few ways. Firstly, when you have now private agencies running the police force, it results in a reduction of trust and respect in the police force, in the policemen that roam the streets. Why is that so? Because the impression now in the minds of the public is that what motivates the policeman and the police force in general is not truly fidelity to the law or fidelity to the constitution. It's truly what really motivates them is money. You are interested in this job, you as the police force, what motivates you? Of course, you do a job, take criminals, but what motivates you? It's not fidelity to law, but simply that of money. So, and over time, you're going to have the risk that they are going to be perceived by the public as no different from private security guards who are there with a gun, they have a bacon, they have a uniform. But what motivates them is not truly they're just a law order, but what motivates simply is money. That's a bad thing. Why is that so? Because trust and respect in the police officers is a very important part of effective policing. It's the reason why, for example, when a policeman goes into a bar and there's a fight going on, but he doesn't need to pull out a gun. He doesn't do. The bar people can get scared because there's enough respect for the man in blue. He's walked in, there's a certain semblance of authority attached to the uniform force. You respect, you believe that he cares for the law to stand firm. Yeah, of course, there are issues of incidents of violence and that happening in the police force. But at least even now in the status quo, people still generally respect the policeman who are truly interested in the job, or truly interested in working for the public good. Why is that so? Because we all know policemen aren't paid well. Like, it's not the best job in the world. And most people for like police, they can get pension, but there's going to be any people who are too interested in serving the community, picking it out, joining the academy, being part of a proud tradition. So just for in the status quo, people are more willing to give information to policemen when the investigations are done. On this side of the house, what is the risk happening is that people are going to start seeing them as private security guards. They're not less interested in cooperating them. Let's give information. Let's to just agree to settle that with the neighbor by just walking away instead of my quick fights with the cops. Like, that's why it's a bad thing. Secondly, we argue that you're going to have less coordination between police officers, police forces from different states. This is important. Under that model, you're going to have different companies running different police officers in different states. This is important because a lot of crime is cross-border or trans-border, at least within America. Like crime that happens in mafia in one part of America often has links to agencies that exist, to groups that exist elsewhere. And given that now it's a private company that runs these forces, they're less incentivized to cooperate because there's nothing in it for them, right? Because if you do well enough, because if that company does well in that state, in like Missouri, because of the person I gave him, you do well, then you look better. You sign up for people to get your contract the following year. Hence, you have less effective cooperation, less effective coordination among the police forces within America, and hence you get less ability to crack down on crime that happens across borders on organized crime. Lastly, we argue that given that police forces often change the management, since they don't fight people easily, randomly, there's going to be less of a belief from the guys at the bottom, the police corps, that the management are the same. Hence, there's less of a chain of command effect, because people don't believe that it's a permanent structure, and hence it's harder to get that issue. All these reasons we clearly back to, of course.
Now I'd like to invite the guest here.
I'm going to first rebut closing opposition's extension.
after which I'm going to deal with a bunch of material that he ignored coming from a member of government that we think was very vital to the debate. He came up here and essentially told us that policemen will be seen as overglorified security guards, and without that honor, that they won't be able to do their jobs well, because we all know policemen get paid really low, so it must be a very honorable service anyway. I have a couple of rebuttals against that. One, that's got nothing to do with honor. The fact that they are policemen could also be indicative of the fact that they can't do anything else or aren't as academically proficient to do other things, Madam Chair. And so we don't think there's an expectation of selflessness when it comes to policemen that gives them that same amount of respect. That's rebuttal number one. But two, the kinds of respect for your profession is predicated on your occupation, right? It's predicated on the relevance and the kinds of risks you take when you undertake the kinds of policing and law enforcement. That's why security guards would get less respect, because their job inherently is less hazardous and less risky when it comes to the actual enforcement of law and order within these compounds as opposed to police officers. So we don't think that the degree of respect for police officers change just because they are no longer employed by the state anymore. They still do a dangerous job. They still may not get paid that highly, and they still do a very effective job at making sure and putting their lives on the line in many of these instances anyway. So we don't think that it's very much predicated on this idea that you have to be stupid, you have to be like a selfless blue cop in order for you to get kind of respect to maintain social order. But here's the kicker. If you are a cop who's often racially abusive and someone that people don't respect anyway in a community like Hurt Village in Mississippi, we don't think that kind of respect still holds true anyway, Madam Chair. We think at the end of the day, the allegations about police brutality have been at an all-time high. Public mistrust when it comes to government police officers is at an all-time high. You clearly cannot get away with the argument that says that we need them to be state employed so they are respected. We think that is bullshit that doesn't stand. What exactly was the arguments we brought forward to you today that he conveniently ignored? We told you it was important to empower people on the ground. In multiple ways, we told you why this is the best way for us to not just reduce police brutality, but increase cooperation between police officers and civilians as well. As I told you earlier, the problem with the government service or government service planners, the government policemen these days, is that many of them grow up in the communities their entire lives, and they have the same racial prejudices that extend and they've been ingrained with altogether, and that extends even in the way they manifest their actual policing. So they are much more likely to presume certain prejudices about black communities or more marginalized communities in the area they end up policing, and that's problematic. What's the difference, you will ask? The difference is, what happens here is that you can have outsourcing of individuals who are seen as professionals who come in to police different types of communities and therefore don't have the same prejudices. But the second benefit here is that they don't carry the same stigma of being this privileged white male cop that's here to abuse his power against marginalized black individuals. And that disassociation from that community is important and can only be done when you are a private corporation that can enforce this in a professional way, where you don't keep that racial prejudicial baggage on you as a cop and in the way you're perceived by the communities as well. That is empowering to people. That allows them to be more cooperative when it comes to policemen and actually empower and report crimes when it comes to police brutality. That's why it increases public trust in the system, which is ultimately the most important thing in terms of dealing with crime. And that was a unique extension we provided you, which he simply asserted away. Sit down. But secondly, we also told you that allegations of police brutality are a reflection of a deeper problem. They are indicators of state failure. The reason why black people are very unhappy is not just because of police brutality, but it's a sign that economic policies have failed to reach out to them and empower the communities as a whole. Like mismanagement of state funding, of state education programs to have marginalized certain communities. The problem here also is when you don't have that disassociation from government or state arc, the problem is you are seen as instruments of oppression that extend and do the job for governments themselves. And therein lies the problem. Therefore, when it's seen as a public service, the expectation there is that you're not doing a very good job with what's the best interest of society. And that's why we think people have a much larger incentive to not cooperate with the police, have allegations of police brutality, which often lead to an escalative sense of violence, right? When you have so much friction within a community, within policemen and ghettos and slums, sit-downs, and therefore we think that's problematic. Therefore, professional private policemen have the ability to immunize themselves from these inceptions. When they're not seen as actors of the state, but they're seen as individuals who moderate, or the state is seen as a moderator between the police force and the people, and that's why people are much more likely to cooperate with the police individuals, as they see them as impartial, unbiased actors. But more than that, it's a lot easier to hold policemen accountable when it comes to being able to call them up and reporting them to the police, to governments themselves. That was the extension he completely important in this debate. Before I go on, yes, sir.
Sir, if a white policeman shoots an unarmed black teen, we are able to talk about it and address structural state failures and discrimination. Under your model, it just becomes a business mistake. Which one better does
Okay, yeah, we'll come to that. So basically, this whole incentive to cover up thing. Like one, it's a lot harder for us to, it's a lot easier for us to cover up when reputation as a line. So basically, he came up here and told us like, when government, and this is the second issue. When you own the force, you are responsible for the day-to-day management of the force and its everyday activities. When you award contracts, the difference here becomes that you are able to monitor, and then these are things which are unforeseeable, that you cannot predict on part of private organizations when they do commit crimes. But the fact that you can terminate their contracts and hold them responsible is an indicative of your own good governance. And that's the reason why they don't bear the liability of awarding state contracts all the time. But let's move on to this whole idea of, oh, we will crack down on white-collar crime, there's a business profit here. I think Anil dealt with this beautifully when he told you that like, the civil asset forfeiture already proves to you that when state-run police departments work on tight budgets, they face an equal credit crunch of making sure they tighten their belts and making sure they do what's for the profitable. So there really is no difference when it comes to profit incentive, because they have the maximum incentive to make sure that they operate on a really like low expenses kind of a system, so they can equally go after like white-collar crimes and make sure that they have the appearance of making sure that they're doing their jobs. But we don't think that's actually this very different at all. The second thing was, we said, but mayors coming up there is not a problem. See, you have to realize that this was a rebuttal when they came up here and said that, oh, they will go after one types of crimes only. But that happens even when mayors are politicized. You get it? Every 5 years, we always put like a very arbitrary focus on the directions of the types of policing we want to do. How is that any different from your idea that we will only go after certain types of criminals when you have institutionalized it and made that part of your system, Madam Chair? And that's something that's important. But lastly, we also told you that state, like the fact that the state can hold you accountable is something that's extremely important. And his response to this was, you will be skewed, like every corporate company is akin to Fox. Like, who's a Republican now, right? Like, it's so weird, right? Like, we don't think just because you're a corporation, you get media biased against you. In fact, because you're a corporation and because we like to paint the picture of big evil corporations, we have much more of an incentive to make sure that these people go to hell for the things they've done. It makes sure that public cooperation is good, public trust in police systems are good, and public trust in governments managing day-to-day activities is good, because we provided the most valuable analysis in this debate. We're very proud to propose.
And now let's invite the last piece of the debate, the opposition.
Let's just deal with all the non-mutually exclusive things before we deal with the unique advantages and disadvantages. Really what this debate is about in terms of comparisons. I think that's with issues like responsiveness of the police, accountability, whistleblowing. I think that there are a lot of different mechanisms being thrown back and forth, particularly the very excellent one, ombudsman, I should spend a lot of time talking about that never wanted to engage with. Because things like prejudice. We think like there's no reason why we can't hire a more racially representative police force. No reason why we can't have exchange programs. No reason why we can't shift officers across neighboring communities. If that's the sort of like outsider perspective you want to have, there's no reason why we still can't keep a core group of people who know the terrain well and establish relationship with the people. There's a unique benefit I'm going to talk about later. Even talk about like the problem with the police force as a state institution in that it becomes an instrument, seen as an instrument of oppression because the state is evil. Like, I hardly think that bringing in these rich corporations is going to improve the standing or like improve the perception of this police force anymore, given that these poor black marginalized individuals probably still see these evil corporations as people out to exploit them and get them anyway. Like, more importantly, if you talk about incentives cover up, I should tell you that a government will appoint a contractor also has incentive to cover up for his mistakes because he is then intrinsically also tied to that. His reputation is also intrinsically tied to the contractor to a certain extent. Yes, they can change the contractor. Government appoints a police commissioner, can also change the police commissioner. So, like, a large part of it is really the same thing. So, it hasn't been particularly enlightened. What are the unique disadvantages of private security firms? Which is something Ashok brought to you that never wanted to engage with. We told you about massive
inefficiencies that are, frankly speaking, unacceptable. When I talk to you about things like cooperations between states or like between neighboring states to deal with a lot of things like transboundary crime, which are a large part of the things that police force have to do with things like drug trafficking, human trafficking, gang networks, and the such. Because I do not wish to share my information with a rival company operating in the neighboring state, I don't want them to have a better understanding of our protocols and the way we work, of the best methods to deal with best experience to deal with certain crimes. For example, I have no incentive to share vital information with other agencies because I want my rival agency to fail so that I can then steal their contract later on. This is in contrast to a nationalized state, so police force, where every incentive to share all sorts of information with each other so that they can build on each other's best practices in order to have more efficient crime fighting units. We think this is terrible because it's not just about tokenism as openly talked about or KPIs. We think it's about pure neglect and sometimes actively trying to sabotage rival companies due to rivalry and selfish interest. We think to the extent that that's the case. And let's face it, like what's the reputation is going to be even worse because people know, like the citizens know and are keenly aware that these corporations are not working because they care about the community. They're not working because for public interest. They're working for money, and that's why the public's keenly aware of this, and that's why they feel that they have no ownership over a company that views them as a customer rather than serving them as a national police force for honor and glory. Sit down. They try to put this idea of respect, and I think that's particularly problematic and dismissive. Because even though respect is not something you can touch and hold, it is so vital to the operation of the police force. And I'm going to explain to you why in the next issue, the unique advantages of a nationalized police force. We told you that the respect of police force as an institution of the state and hence a representative of power is particularly important. They said we don't want people to view police as demigods. We say actually that might not be a particularly bad thing. Rather than a security guard they can challenge at any point in time, like the security guard that stopped me from entering my school because I forgot to bring my pass. Who are you? You're just a salary employee of some company that I don't care about you. Receive any training, like who are you? Okay, you can be changed anytime, the company can be changed anytime. Why in the world should I care about you? So when I see like an officer from Cisco or G4S, they are glorified security guards and agency external to the state, right? This problematic because the ability of police force to do good work relies heavily on what the public perceives them to be, right? So we think it's important that like we don't just view police or security officers as salary employees of private corporations that can change at any time. It really affects the way we view them and we respect them. We think citizens are much less likely to cooperate with Cisco, to volunteer information with them, to join community outreach programs with them. Because I don't see Cisco as a servant of the public interest, and I know they just want to make money, right? So especially if I'm unhappy with Cisco's policies, instead of talking to them and trying to see how I can sort it out, I just like sort of reflect to the government, tell them to change and get another freaking company into the resources. And I think it's only problematic because that there's really that linkage between the community and the police force is completely broken. This, as Ashok told you, now I have problems. I may not want to go to Cisco security guard, right? Because I don't think he can mediate the situation between a dispute between me and my neighbor. Both of us might end up hating on the police officer and abusing the police officer at the same time because again, who are you, right? So sit down. This is why the permanence of the state's national police force is important, because the continued reality that we live and work with, that I build that's why I've been trying to build a constructive relationship with the national police uniform inspires both fear and respect, and that's why they are the friendly neighborhood police force or sheriff. The guy I know, like I've seen, he's from my community, he's a part of who I am. He knows and cares for me, and that's why I'm incentive to work with him and care about him. Yes, open it.
Interstate cooperation can happen when you give it to one company versus 50 different companies across states.
Wait, but the benefit, all the benefits coming out from you is to tell me that these companies can change and that's why they're accountable because there's competition. If you're telling me to grab everything over to one single company, then all the problems are blown up even more because then it's hard to change, right? Then all those problems become even worse, right? And like that also means that the competitive bidding process then in effect fails because you create a state monopoly and the super military establishments that all were talking about, right? So maybe they're trying to support you after all, right? So last but not least, we think as a result of like also due to the result of the respect, this also hurts long-term planning
important. Things like ties to community outreach programs, crime prevention programs, dealing with youth delinquencies, going to school to have awareness programs. Like, first of all, we even listen to the Cisco officer. We think even things like long-term crime fighting strategies, it's not as extreme as what opening said in terms of they're saying that, oh, they'll ensure that crime can exist so that we still have a job. But we think, given there's no real care or concern for the community or for long-term strategies, like for example, the drug problem, right? That's something that takes 20 and 30 years of continued research, working with academics to review and see how exactly we can improve the problem, right? But if you're only there for 5 years, you don't know whether you'll be there for another 5 years. What incentive do you have to care? And that's the problem, because crime is a long-term problem that requires long-term solution, and private companies don't have that long-term prospect. Very, very proud of those.
Yeah, yes,
My God.